Hey there, I'm Alex. Today I want to talk about Nuke script optimization. The goal behind this video is that I share with you as much as I've learned in terms of optimizing your Nuke scripts. I've been doing this for a while and I've seen both the good and bad, so the idea here is to make Nuke scripts that run more efficiently. Let me get started right here. I have a series of examples that I'm going to go through and explain each one. A very obvious one, of course, is Prcomps. Prcomps is key when it comes to having an efficient script, but at the same time, you don't want to overdo it. So it's a bit of a delicate balance. Yes, there are things that you should definitely be pre-comping, but you don't want to be pre-comping every 3 steps because it kind of defeats the purpose. The examples I have here are things like any denoising. You definitely want to have that pre-comped. Usually scanline renders, unless you're doing something that's quite light, you can keep it light, but for the most part, you're going to be pre-comping that. Things like smart vectors, then something like particle systems. Anything that's particle related, you either want to pre-comp it or disable it once you're done with it, or sometimes even have them living in a completely different script. Because even if it's not being used by the script, just by it being inside the script is going to process in the background at times. So you want to be very careful with particle systems. What I do is I don't always have them in separate scripts unless it's something massive. What I do is I just keep them live, and once I'm done with it, I just disable the whole system and just keep my pre-comp live. So that's the way I handle it for the most part. Again, unless it's a very big particle system. Anything related with copycat. Inference nodes. Inference nodes are very heavy, so that's something you definitely want to keep on separate scripts. And when you have your inference node in your actual script, make sure that the output from the inference is always pre-comped. Then obviously things like deep reads, any deep data is quite heavy and requires a lot of bandwidth to be read. So what I like to do is that you want to do as much work before you hit the deep to image. And once you're ready, make sure that you pre-comp that so that you're not constantly reading the raw deep renders. Next up is just a personal choice. This is something I do in my scripts, and that's using pre-comp switches. So the way I have it set up here is that I have my tree, I have my write node, I have the render of that write node. So I read in the result from that write node, and whether I'm keeping it live or not, then I just switch between 1 and 0. So this is just a standard switch, nothing fancy going on here other than the color node. So this is a way for me to not have to rewire things every time I decide to keep things live in a script or go with a pre-comp. And not only that, but very quickly I can tell just by the color of the node whether I'm looking at the result from the tree or the actual pre-comp. So if I see my pre-comp switches be all green, then I know that I can ignore whatever's going up above. That's just the way I do it. But like I said, pre-comp switches are great for me just because I don't have to constantly be rewiring the script in order to see different results. Next up is a setting that I don't see enough people taking advantage of, and that is the way that the postage stamps preview are clips. If I just view one of these, and I'm just going to set this to input just so that we can see the proper thing, what's going to happen is that as I move around in a timeline, you'll see that our postage stamps is updating along with whatever is on screen. So if I go here, you see how it updated, and if I go to this one, let's say, and I go to the very end, you'll see our postage stamp here is constantly updating with what's here, and that has a much bigger toll than people realize. So for me, I don't necessarily need to have these things live, and actually not necessarily, I never really have it live. A way of changing that is if you just hit Shift S, that'll bring in the preferences. And under node graph, you want to change this drop down from current frame to static. So what that will do is that now if we go back to our viewer, if I scrub around here, you'll see that my postage stamps are not updating at all. They're just static. I believe they're just grabbing the first frame. This is a very easy way of having a big impact on your scripts, especially when you have a lot of read nodes. If you just set this to static, believe me, your life is going to be that much better. This is one I highly recommend. Next up is using stamps, and this is a pretty big one, and at this point, most studios are using it as a standard. Stamps is just a way of having one read node populate through a script. So if you have your main plate here, you can just make essentially infinite amount of copies, and this is way more efficient than just copying and pasting the plate all over your script. Stamps is a must-have. If you haven't, and if you've never heard of it, definitely go ahead and check it out, and you can check it out here on Adrian Puello's website. It's awesome, it's free, and you should be using it. And not only does it work for plates, but you can attach anything from the 3D system as well is also stampable, so definitely take a look at stamps. It's going to make your scripts that much better. The next one is an interesting one, and this is one that is sometimes overlooked, and that's the importance of bounding boxes and keeping up with them and making sure that things are tidy and that you're not processing more pixels than you need. Let me show you a few examples here. So if I look at the result of me overing this color wheel on the checkerboard, what you'll see is that we have all the space on the sides that's not really being used or potentially not being used, you have a couple options. You can either just, add a crop as you would expect, and that would get rid of anything that's outside that bound. The problem with not doing that is that there's going to be a lot of things in your comps that are going to be processing those pixels outside the limit, which is why it's so important to keep an eye on your bounding box and making sure that you're not introducing more information that you actually need to process. So I have a few examples here. There's a very clear way of just not having to be cropping every 5 seconds, and that's just by changing the default way of key mixes and nodes like merges handling these bounding boxes. So if I open my key mix here, what you'll see is that there is a set bounding box dropdown, and you can set that either to union, B, or A. What we're looking at here right now is actually being set to union. So what that means is that it's grabbing both bounding boxes and it's smashing them together and making a new bounding box from the two. So it's essentially adding the bounding boxes together. You might want that sometimes, but I imagine most times that's not going to be the case. So it's always good practice to just set this to B. And you see that way, if you have a tidy B pipe, right, as you go upstream, then anything you connect inside, you should be able to just set to B side, and that's going to take care of that. Alternatively, you can just set it to union, of course, if you're going to be using the pixels outside of that margin. Another important one here is the use of regular versus intersect inside of crop, and I'll show you exactly what that does. So you see how we have this really neat and tidy bounding box where we have our color wheel, and the bounding box is much smaller than the whole frame, which is a very good thing. So if you want to keep something like that, the problem is that if you just chuck a crop on it, it's going to make it much less efficient, because now it's going to be processing every single pixel within the frame. Whereas before we had a neat bounding box that's telling us this is where the information is. You can ignore the rest. If I open that crop setting, you see how we have an intersect tick here. This is something that I rarely see used, and it's actually very, very powerful. If I go back to my other example, it's the exact same crop, but with the intersect turned on. And you see the difference here is that instead of it forcing you to have a full frame bounding box, it's going to look at the image, or it's going to look at the information coming up the pipe and find what is the least amount of bounding box you can get away with. So if you're already feeding it this information at the top here, then it'll just inherit it as we go down. And this is very, very important. And again, I don't see a lot of people using the intersect function inside of the crop nodes. Another option you have is that there are actually a lot of reasons why you would want a larger bounding box. You don't necessarily need to just crop it all out, or it's not binary whether it's fully on or fully off. You can still do a bit of maintenance on your bounding boxes as you go through your script, and this is at least the way I handle it. So let's say that there is valuable information in here, but we might be going a bit too tall and maybe too much on the side. So you can use a node, something like bbox, to format, and what that's going to do is it's going to crop, but it's also going to make it so that you're giving it a limit. So in this case, I'm giving it a limit of 200 pixels of overscan, and that way you are still keeping information outside of the frame, but you're not using a lot more than you had before, which was probably not needed. This is a way of balancing it out, where it's either not fully on or off. This is just a way of shrinking it, where it has enough for you to still do things down the line, but not having to process the huge bounding box that was probably coming down the B pipe. So then you can see here, and once I add this here, I can still transform my comp, and I'm not missing out on any information that was past the frame. Next up is concatenation, and this is one I feel very strongly about, because you can make things much more expensive for you if you're not mindful about how you're stacking nodes. So a lot of the nodes in Nuke are color coded, and usually that means that if you plug them in together, they're going to concatenate. You can just hop on the documentation and you can find a lot of information on concatenation and find out which of these nodes concatenate and which not. But I just want to point that out, that the color is there for a reason. And yes, it's not all about concatenation, but it is a part of it. And when you stack nodes like this, let's say if you look at these three nodes stacked and these three nodes stacked, they're essentially being processed together as one. Whereas if you have things in the middle, right? So let's say we have blur and then we add another blur. If you do this, right, versus doing something like this, this is way more efficient than doing this. So you always want to make sure that these nodes stay together so that they process as one. And then if you do this, you're just essentially doing a lot of extra processes that you don't really need to get the same result. Same goes with transforms. So you definitely want to keep an eye on that, because I promise you it's going to make your life easier. Not only that, you can actually retain image quality by smartly concatenating your nodes. And this is an example I have here. So if I have, say I have my checkerboard, I'm going to zoom in here just so that we can see the quality. If I look at the wrong way of building this, which is separating these transforms by a different node, I'm setting this transform to a value of scale of 2, and then I'm bringing it down to a scale of 0.5. So if I look at the result here, it's going to be the exact same size as the original plate, as you can see. However, if I get really close in here, and I show you that because there is something breaking that concatenation, we are losing quality on our image. It's being clearly degraded. However, if you were to do this differently, let's say we do that this way, and we have the same thing where we have our first transform set to 2 and the second one set to 0.5. If I look at the plate versus the output, it looks exactly the same. You want to make sure that you process those nodes together as much as possible. It doesn't mean that there aren't cases where you don't need to separate them, but for the most part, keep an eye on that, because again, not only is that going to result in a better image, but it's also going to be a lot more efficient within your script. Next up is node efficiency. And this is a very important one, because the reality is that not all nodes have the same processing cost. So if you're doing something as simple as just changing the gain in an image, you should probably be using a multiply, because of all these 3 nodes, this is the cheapest one to run. If I open the properties here for each, the nodes get progressively more complex and have a lot more knobs. You can imagine in the background, processing a multiply is a lot cheaper than processing a grade, and a lot cheaper than processing a color correct. A lot of people just use grades for everything or color corrects for everything. I would strongly suggest that you start thinking about the size of these property panels, because even if you're not changing the knobs for things you aren't using, you're still getting a processing tax on not going with the cheaper option. So again, if you just want to increase the value of an image, definitely stick with the multiply. Then if you start having the need to use things like the offset or the gamma or the black and white points, you can just upgrade to a grade, but never by default use color correct on everything or grades on everything. This is very important, and it's not specific to just these grades. Like there's other sets of grades that get progressively more and less efficient. Like a blur is of course very cheap compared to a defocus or a C-defocus. And yes, while these produce a specific image, you don't necessarily need this all the time. And I do see people using a defocus as it were a blur, and that's just never a good idea. And then we also have things like a transform. Transform is of course the cheapest. You want to stay away from a transform mask unless you are going to be using that mask input. And as long as you can get away with getting the same effect of a corner pin as a transform, you should be doing that, because this transform is always going to be cheaper than a corner pin. So just food for thought. But whenever you're building, just make sure that you're using a node that does what you want it to do, but not other 10 things, because it starts not making sense having to add all that extra processing on what should be a fairly simple task. Next up is the order of operations, which again falls more or less in line with concatenation, but you want to make sure that you can group as many things that are similar together and leave the heavier stuff for the end, if possible. Just start being mindful of how your trees are built and when the heavy stuff really needs to make an entrance. So if you can get away with keeping the heavy stuff to later in your comp, it's going to make things that much easier until you hit that spot. Another one that I don't see a lot of people taking advantage of is the ApplyMaterial node. What I have here is an example of, we have 3 different geometries, and they might all be using the same image to be projected onto them. And in this way, we're processing this 3 times. However, if you use the ApplyMaterial, not only are you able to use the texture once, but you can actually use nodes like in this case, the diffuse node. You only need to process it once. So the ApplyMaterial node is a good way of just keeping all your geometries using one shader and one texture without having to do the same calculation more than once. Next up, let's talk about the ScanlineRender. If we look at the ScanlineRender, this is going to be a very common thing to see. And I'm going to go ahead and bring up my viewer. What you're going to be seeing from a lot of people is that they will attach a constant to the ScanlineRender. And the problem with doing that is that it'll inherit the bounding box of the constant. And that's never a good thing. If I look at the output from my ScanlineRender here, what you'll see is that the bounding box is the frame, right? Like that is the bounding box. And that's because we're using a constant as the background input for the ScanlineRender. If I go ahead and look at the exact same setup, but using a reformat instead of a constant, you'll see that our bounding box is now limited to whatever is being rendered and not a full frame. So think about it as, because it has pixel data as a bounding box by default, and that bounding box is being inherited by the output of the ScanlineRender, Whereas the reformat doesn't really have a bounding box, it's more of a container. And because it doesn't have a bounding box, whenever we get our output, it's sticking to strictly what it needs to generate that image. Very, very important. Another important thing to keep in mind when working with the ScanlineRender is that even though we're looking at our RGB output here, if we look closely at the node, it's outputting a lot more channels than we might need. So always keep in mind that if I look at the layer context sheet here, you see we're getting a depth pass, we're getting the RGBA, as well as the forward pass. If you're not going to be using any of those extra passes, it's always a good idea to just add a remove node. And you can just either set it to remove the nodes you want to remove, or just set the node to keep and say, in this case, let's just say RGBA. That way, you're going from a bunch of different channels that you might not have needed to the ones you just need. And of course, going down the line, that's going to make it that much cheaper to process. The next one here is the ScanlineRender I just used myself. And this is just something that I quickly put together for myself. And the neat thing about this ScanlineRender is that I have a user tab. So if I go in here, I can just set my GUI samples and my render samples. So effectively what this is doing is that while I'm inside my comp, I'm only rendering with one sample. But the moment it hits the farm, it's going to be bumped up to whatever value I put here. If you're interested in seeing how to put together this node, I have a video about it that I did a few months ago. And I'll post a link below for you, or it should be somewhere up here. Next is all about being smart when it comes to limiting the motion blur that you're calculating. So while yes, you might need higher render samples, sometimes you can get away with a low sample value. And if your scene isn't really action heavy, you can actually calculate camera motion blur in a less expensive way just by using motion blur 3D along with a vector blur. So what this is doing, it's taking the camera information and then it's applying the motion blur to your image, but that's going to be strictly for camera motion blur. Anything dynamic happening in the scene, let's say you have a cube animating left to right, this is not going to be introducing motion blur to that cube. This is only going to be introducing motion blur to motion coming from the camera. While yes, this can make your renders a lot cheaper, if you have objects moving inside of your scene, this is not a catch-all solution. Next up is channels. And channels is, well, it's quite important. You want to make sure that you use the remove node as much as you can or as much as you need, and make sure that you tidy up your channels every so often in your script. If you look at your B pipe and there's a lot of extra channels that you're not really using, you should always be trimming them. So the way I do it is I just say keep, and then I can just select whatever I want. In this case, let's just set it to RGBA. And that way, you know that you're keeping a tidy B pipe, because the problem with having extra channels is that there are other nodes that will by default process the information on all channels. And that's another thing to be mindful of. So if you have your RGBA and then you have an extra 3 passes in the background just taking a ride along in your B pipe, if you do that, then whenever it hits one of these nodes and they are set to all instead of just being set to, let's say, RGBA or RGB, you're going to be paying for all that processing time and processing powers. Definitely make sure that you keep that in mind, and that not only do you keep your channels in check, but even if you do have more channels than you need, something like a grade, it doesn't need to grade all channels. You're probably just looking to grade the RGB, so make sure that you make a habit of changing the settings inside the channels of nodes like a grade or a blur to just stick to whatever it is you need and ignore the rest. Then I have an example here of the right node. Sometimes people just tend to leave this at default, and that will render all channels all the time. But most times you're going to be needing just to render the RGB or RGBA. So make sure that you're mindful and you change that wherever it makes sense. And then for channels, it's also important for you to keep in mind that sometimes there are tools that will introduce extra channels into your comps. And you might not know about it, but it's always a good idea. If it's a tool that you're not fully familiar with, always check that nothing funky is going on. So if I look at my input here, I have the RGBA. If I look at my grade here out now, see I have these extra squares. That means that there is more data than was coming in initially. So if I look at this through a layer context sheet, you see we're introducing both a depth and a forward pass, and that's usually something you don't like. So you can either go inside and make sure that you tidy that up, or again, like I was saying before, just make sure that you add a remove node and then you just keep whatever you had before. You do have a couple options, but always be mindful of tools that you grab off the internet, because they might be introducing data into your stream that you might not want. Next up is particles. I mentioned them at the beginning. Particles are very taxing, and most times are being calculated even if they're not plugged into your script. So make a good habit of either having them in a different script or disabling them altogether once you're done using them. Another important one is the $GUI expression, and this is something that you're probably all very familiar with, but in case you're unfamiliar, what $GUI does is that you can just go into a node, and then if I open it here, let's say a vector blur, right? I can just go here into the node tab, and if I right click the disable option and I say add expression, if I type here $GUI, you see the result is 1. And if I say $GUI, it's going to be the inverse, so 0, 1. If I do that, right, actually not like that, but I want to make it without the exclamation mark. If I do this, our node is going to be bypassed until it renders. Think about it this way. As long as the graphical user interface is open, then it's going to be disabled. But the moment it hits the farm and it renders through command line, then this node is going to be enabled. You usually want to have this expression attached to nodes that are very expensive, and there's a few ways of doing it. And the example I just gave you is just by adding the $GUI expression to the disable knob. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. I'm going to say no animation, yes, and turn that back on. There's, of course, other ways of taking advantage of the $GUI expression. So what I have here is a regular transform node, and this is just one that I've modified that I use at times. So if I know that I'm going to be using the motion blur knob, what I have done here is that I've added a motion blur tab, and I can just have this set to 0 when I'm inside my script. But when it hits the farm, it's going to up the samples something like 5 or 3, whatever it is you select. And this, of course, can be very expensive to keep live. So rather than having the transform node completely disabled, you can just do it this way. And the way this is built is if I right-click my motion blur knob here and check the edit expression, this is the expression that I'm running. So I have on my motion blur tab up here, I have something called GUI samples, and I also have something called render samples. So I make sure that whether the user interface is on or off, I have a different value. So 0 or 3, 0, 5, whatever it is you select. Again, very easy to set up, can help you keep things speedy. You want to zoom out here, I'm going to close this. And again, I just have a series of notes here of examples that would be good ideas for you to add $GUI expression to. So again, particle emitter, we talked about before. I'm more of a proponent of just disabling it altogether, but you do have that option. You don't necessarily need to add $GUI to just a bunch of nodes by hand. There are these things called GUI switches where you can just have it so that if we have our B pipe coming up here and we have an expensive node coming up, you can just have this set up to render time. So the GUI switch is only going to be reading the GUI side until it hits the farm, and it's going to switch to the render input on render time. So this is another way of keeping your nodes intact and having a node like the GUI switch deal with going back and forth. And then what I have here is also consider doing, I call this the motion blur controls. And this is a very easy node setup. You see all I have here is a checkbox, right? So I say here motion blur on or off. And what I've done is I've attached this to 2 other nodes that might have an expensive effect. So if I look at the expressions here for the CD focus, I've attached it to the disable knob here. So if I just hold control and drag this out into my disable knob, you see what's going to happen is it's actually doing the inverse of what you want. And again, if you find this, you can just right click, hit expression, and make sure that you add an exclamation mark at the beginning, and that's going to give you the inverse result, which in this case is disabling our node. So that's the case for the C defocus here. Whereas for the transform, I've attached it strictly to the motion blur of the transform node. So you can see now, if I toggle this on and off, you can see the results on both nodes changing as I do this. So this is a way of controlling many heavy nodes at the same time. If you do have the need to sometimes go ahead and preview things at full quality, you can just set up a node like this and make sure that you expression link it to where it needs to be. And then you can just quickly turn on and off the expensive stuff, but still getting full quality preview of your comp inside of your viewer. Next up is about image compression and file size. I'm personally a big fan of DWA and DWAB. I know of a lot of studios that use DWA as a final output compression. If you are going to be dabbling in that, what I would recommend, or at least the settings I like, is to have DWA set to a compression level of 45. And for DWAB, I like to keep it at 150. I might go as low as 100, but usually 150 is a safe bet. And your studio might not want you to do this as a final output, but that doesn't mean that as you work your comp, you can make your life a lot easier by reading files that are less heavy. So you can just use this as you build your comp and then just switch it at the end when you're done and ready to deliver your shot. Next up is being mindful of nodes that have a GPU toggle. As you can see, nodes like Chronos, Vector Blur, and Convolve, they all have this option of use GPU if available. So you do want to keep that on to be as efficient as you can in your script. This takes advantage of your GPU, which is usually a lot more efficient at doing certain tasks. And while most of these nodes have the knobs turned on by default, it's usually a good idea to double check. Next up is a bit of a rapid fire to wrap up, and that's take advantage of region of interest when possible. And what this does is, let me just expose down here. There's this button here at the top, and it enables the region of interest. And as you can see, it's telling you the hotkey is Shift W. So if I look at my viewer here, again, I can just do Shift W, and you have this area where anything that's inside of that area is going to be processed and the rest is going to be ignored. So if you're dealing with a very heavy effect or a very heavy comp, you can just preview the area that you're actually working on and you can ignore the rest regardless of the zoom level of your viewer. Next is taking advantage of the proxy and the viewer, and make sure that you change the proxy scale in settings, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. If we look again up here, you'll find this little button and that will turn on or off proxy mode for you. See, if it's highlighted yellow, that means that it's on. If I click it again, it turns white and that means it's no longer being processed as a proxy. Be careful with proxies though, because while yes, they can make things faster to preview, not all nodes behave the same when being rendered through a proxy. If you do decide to use it, make sure that you check your settings. So I'm here on my node graph. If I hit S, make sure that the proxy mode is set to the correct amount or scale. Then the next one here is going to be to render only the frames you need. Sometimes you might have a longer frame range, but specific effects that live in Prcomps might not be present for the whole duration of the shot. Make sure that you're mindful and you're not rendering more frames than you actually need. If an effect is only present for 50 frames in a shot and the shot is 200 frames long, there's really no need to render the effect for the full durations. Just be mindful that whenever you're rendering, keep it strictly to what you need and what's visible. And then finally, to wrap up, make sure that you are mindful about your cache. There is this option here. If we go to the top menu, we click cache here, there is always a clear all option, which I actually use quite often. And that's going to make it so that your cache is reset. However, there are times where clearing cache is just not enough and the software is just bogged down because you've been doing too many things for too long. Sometimes it's a good idea to restart Nuke altogether or even restart the machine. I hope this was useful, and if I missed anything, by all means leave it in the comments because it's going to help anyone that comes along and it's going to help me learn something new, always looking to learn something new. I hope these tricks make your scripts run smoother, more efficiently, and if you're a junior or something trying to move up, this is the kind of thing that a comp supervisor opening your script is going to be very happy to see. So make sure you apply as many of these tricks as possible within reason, and I wish everyone efficient scripts. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious. Cheers.